So beginning here with just something fun. This is actually the commemorative stamp released by the French government in the 1970s. Machaut is still very much considered one of the great French poets, and his work is still studied in classes on French literature and so on. So this commemorative stamp was issued. But before we jump into who Machaut was, I thought it was important to start with some background information. Machaut lived during the 14th century, which was a very, very tumultuous century in European history for many different reasons. And those reasons included the papal schism that happened in the 14th century. So that was a situation where, beginning in 1305, a succession of popes decided to live outside of Rome. They chose Avignon as their home, basically because it was a nicer place to live. And this really called into question church doctrine and papal authority. It made people wonder whether these popes were in fact committed to their role as Bishop of Rome. And then to make matters worse, in 1378, there were several popes all at once, each elected by a different group of cardinals, excommunicating each other, battling over tax revenue and the support of the European princes. And in fact, the Catholic Church never really recovered from this scandal. And it paved the way for some of the movements that challenged the church authority further in later centuries, like the Protestant Reformation, for example. Also during the 14th century, we have the 100 Years' War, which is a conflict between France and England. And it's particularly devastating because it's the first time in European history that firearms are used in conflict. And it's a bit like the kind of psychological trauma that was caused by the use of chemical weapons in World War I. Just this inconceivable devastation that had never before been experienced of people killing each other en masse. And it ravaged the French countryside in particular. Most of the battles were fought on French soil rather than on English soil. At the same time, we have climate cooling and resulting poor harvests, so there's not enough food to go around. And that's one of the factors in the Black Death that kills up to 40% of the European population in the 14th century. And also really contributes to this crisis of faith. People start to wonder, does God really exist? Does he really love us? Does he care at all about what's going on here? And it also causes a crisis in available labor, because so many people died that if you happen to be a nobleman who survived, you probably didn't have very many workers on your estate anymore. And this allowed laborers greater bargaining power. They could now pressure their noble employers to give them better deals and better compensation. So there's a major shakeup in authority structures in the 14th century in Europe. And very, very seriously traumatic political and natural disasters. At the same time, we have a bit of a flourishing of the arts in the 14th century. And maybe this is not so surprising, because I think often the arts flourish in response to crisis. But what we see in the 14th century in terms of music has been called the ars nova, or the new art. And that term is taken from the name of a treatise that laid out a new way of measuring and notating musical time. And that interest in musical time actually paralleled interest in time and measuring time in other areas of society. So we see in the 14th century mechanical clocks coming into regular use. This is the great clock of Rouen. It now has a Renaissance facade, but the mechanism was built in the 14th century. And it's one of several 14th century clocks that survive in working order until this day. We also see civic authorities starting to take a really serious interest in recording exact dates of birth of their citizens. So all of these parallel interests in the measurement of time. We won't go into a whole bunch of detail about the notational system that allows for precise recording of rhythmic durations in 14th century music, but it's probably enough to know that it's the precursor of the way that we notate rhythm in Western music today, with time signatures and a whole slew of different note values. And the time signatures actually tell you about the way that the note values can be divided into smaller note values. So if you have a long note, are you dividing that into 2 shorter notes, or are you dividing that into 3 shorter notes? And then at the next level of division, are you dividing those shorter notes into 2 or 3 yet shorter notes? And this system, of course, continues through successively smaller note values. Alongside this change in attitude towards notating rhythm, so just keep in mind that most of the music that we're talking about up to the 14th century is music that either doesn't notate musical rhythm at all beyond the text stress patterns, or it's music that has pretty rudimentary rhythmic notation of just long and short notes or just a handful of note values. So that's changing in the 14th century. And alongside that, we have a couple of other trends that sort of increase musical complexity. And we start to see composers writing music about music, music that foregrounds musical materials and the clever arrangement of musical materials. And there are a few ways that composers engage in this kind of play. One is by giving themselves very, very strict parameters to work within. In France, they were called formes fixes or fixed forms. And these were forms of poetry and music that had very specific rhyme schemes, very specific repetition patterns, and very specific ways that the music had to interact with those elements of the poetry. So that's one way that composers put themselves in a straitjacket and show off their prowess by creating something very beautiful, almost despite the straitjacket of this fixed form. Another way that they play with musical materials is using isorhythm. That's a big word that you don't really need to remember, but what that is repeating rhythmic patterns. So the way this starts is, remember that tenor voice in a motet, that voice that carries the chant, usually just a snippet of chant in long notes. That voice is the musical foundation of whatever is above it. So composers in the 14th century say, we have this musical foundation. Can we make it more interesting and complex than that? And so they do things like they break up the melody of that chant into little segments with repeating rhythmic patterns. So we get this succession of segments with the same rhythm. And then maybe they take that snippet of chant, so the melody, and they repeat it several times. So now you have this kaleidoscopic effect of repeating rhythmic patterns and repeating melodic patterns going on in this chant tenor. And then they think, could we expand this complicated scaffolding through the whole piece? So can we have repeating rhythmic or melodic patterns in the other voices too? And what you end up with is this very complex compositional scaffolding. And it's a bit like admiring a mathematical or an architectural model. It's really bringing to the foreground the techniques and the technical prowess of the composer. And then we also see composers and poets writing very self-aware texts that actually, in some cases, write themselves into the text. So Machaut, for example, tells us a lot of information about who he is and how he makes art in the texts of his poems themselves. So a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. This first motet is a motet by Philippe de Vitry, French composer who wrote the treatise Ars Nova. So he's the one who lays down this new way of notating rhythm. And this motet comes from a very strange manuscript. It's called the Roman de Fauvel. And it is this manuscript containing this long story, this allegorical story about the excesses and indecency and conniving at the French court. And we think that it was composed by French courtiers who were quite bitterly satirizing what they were seeing going on in politics around them. And interspersed in this manuscript are musical compositions, including this one. We're not really sure what this manuscript was for. If you were to perform the entirety of the manuscript, it would take about 30 hours. So it doesn't seem to be something that was really intended to be performed in its entirety, at least. Maybe this is actually sort of art to be admired with your eyes more than anything. Keep in mind that the manuscript production itself would have been tremendously expensive. So it's this strange thing that we have that's come down to us. And this particular motet kind of illustrates what is in this manuscript. So it's in 3 voices. They're Latin texted, so immediately we have an indication of sort of what class of society this is coming from. The lowest voice, the tenor, has that segment of chant, and the tenor sings the text, "Justly we suffer these things." And then above that tenor, there are 2 other voices, each with their own text. And the texts are allegorical. So the uppermost voice has this text talking about Lady Fortune. And it says, "Furious Fortune has not feared to bring down swiftly the tribe which did not shrink from ascending indecently. While for the leader of the foresaid tribe, she has not refrained from preparing the gallows as an eternal mirror in the sight of everyone." And then the second voice tells a story about a whole bunch of animals. And these animals are actually representations of various personages at the French court. So it starts, "Since the gang of thieves from a cave of reprobates, and the fox which had gnawed the cocks in the time in which the blinded lion had ruled, have fallen suddenly by their own deserts." And it continues in this kind of an ilk. So this is a very complicated piece in terms of its social and political significance, in terms of so many texts going on at the same time and making all of this complicated commentary, and also in terms of the music, which really foregrounds rhythmic complexity. And this is also an isorhythmic motet. You probably won't hear the isorhythm when you just listen to this motet. It's sort of one of these underlying compositional devices that's meant to be admired visually by people in the know. But as you listen, I think you'll definitely hear how busy and complicated this music is, and that's part of the intended effect, I think. So, by contrast with Philippe de Vitry, Guillaume de Machaut tends to foreground the art in his music in terms of he writes poetry that's about human emotion, and he writes music that is really aimed at emotional impact. And underlying it is all of this clever mathematical modeling, but it's not there on the surface to be admired. So admittedly, this is a very different kind of piece, but it shows you similar sorts of artistic trends. So this is one of Machaut's rondeaus. We met the rondeau form a couple of weeks ago with that piece from the play Robin and Marian by Adam de la Halle. And at that point, I said that a rondeau was this catchy dance song that was possibly a little bit silly sometimes. Now we're dealing with a kind of rondeau that's much more serious. So this is a text about lost love, and it's in a very formal structure. So you can see here beside the French text, I've added some letters, and these letters have various significances. So all of the A's have the same rhyme at the end of the lines, and all of the B's have a different rhyme. Then the capital letters indicate the lines of the refrain. So this doesn't just have a refrain that happens between every verse and it's a very simple structure. This actually has a repeating pair of lines that begin and end the verse. And then one of those lines comes back in the middle. So you have this structure of repetition that keeps reminding you of an idea through the verse. And then the music maps onto this too. So you'll hear that all of the A lines have a particular musical ending that matches, and all of the B lines have a different musical ending. So there's musical rhyme going on here as well. And you'll also hear that there's a repetitive structure in the music that matches the repetition of the refrain as well. So it's quite a complicated structure, but within this structure, Machaut composes this very, very beautiful, moving song about lost love. So who was Machaut anyway? Machaut was a diplomat, a politician, a clergyman, and a poet-composer. He wore a lot of hats. So for much of his life, he served John of Luxembourg, who was king of Bohemia. And he served him not just in the capacity of an artist, but very much as a political advisor. He traveled a lot and so on. And then later in life, he became the canon at Reims Cathedral, where he witnessed the plague sweep through the town, and he witnessed the siege of that city by the English. So it was a very difficult time in the history of that city. In terms of Machaut's personal life, his position as canon was actually quite a comfortable one that allowed him to work as an artist. Being a canon came with responsibilities. You had to say mass a certain number of times and so on. It also came with certain perks like a house, and it allowed for the delegating of responsibilities to lesser clergymen. So Machaut actually could hire clergymen further down the hierarchy to say mass for him, and that actually allowed him to carve out time to focus on his artistic endeavors, which were formidable. Not only did he produce a lot of poetry and music, he also took a very keen interest in collecting and having that output copied. So we have not one, not two, but 6 separate manuscripts containing his complete works, 4 of which are from his lifetime and 2 from slightly after his life. And he seems to have taken an interest in the whole package. He not only wrote the poetry and the music, but he also contributed to the designing of the illustrations in these manuscripts. He dictated the order that things would appear in the manuscript. One of the manuscripts actually has an inscription saying that this is the order that Guillaume de Machaut wanted these things to appear in. And he tends to order his manuscripts by genre. So he begins with these very long narrative poems called dites that tell of courtly love. And it's actually in these poems that we find a lot about who he was. So we'll see a couple of examples actually over the course of this presentation. But the Livre d'Ouvardi, for example, one of these long poems, is a poem about a poet and a lady. And it basically tells of their correspondence. And the poet is instructing the lady in how to appreciate and how to write poetry. And the lady is responding and actually coming back with critiques of the poet's work. And these two fall in love despite their disparate social status. They, in fact, at the end of the poem, they share a couch, apparently. And this is a whole exploration about artistic creation and how that works and how a poet composes a poem. Here are a few images. I'll show you one of Machaut's manuscripts in a moment as well. This is an example of how Machaut incorporates himself into his artistic output. This is an illustration from one of the manuscripts. We'll see the whole illustration in a second, but here's Machaut himself as a young man, and he is receiving Lady Nature, who is presenting him with several of her children, sense, rhetoric, and music. And Machaut basically says about himself that he was destined for this vocation of poet-composer because of the particular skill set that nature had endowed him with. And this is a very interesting argument to make, because he makes it at a time when vocation was not understood that way. Vocation was understood as something that you were born into because you did the job that your father had done and his father had done before him back through the generations. And it was completely a question of the time and place that you were born into. Machaut says, no, that's not the way it is with me. My vocation has to do with my very particular skill set. Here is the seal of his employer, John of Luxembourg. And here is Bonne of Luxembourg, John's daughter. She was one of Machaut's greatest supporters and patrons, despite the fact that she died at age 34 of the plague. And you see her here depicted beside her husband, who became Jean II of France. She actually died a couple months before her husband was crowned King of France, so she never became Queen of France, but she had borne by that point 10 children to her husband. And we'll see in a few minutes one of the poems that Machaut writes to memorialize her. So I thought what I'd do now is actually share some of Scott's interview and the piece that he wanted to present to you. This is a ballade. Oh, before I do that, let me share with you the manuscript that I was talking about, because it's very, very beautiful and fun to look at. And I'll make sure that you have the link if you want to further explore this manuscript. But let me just make this full screen so that you can see it here. So you can see this is one of the poems. It's full of these beautiful illustrations, also meticulous handwritten text, of course. But if we go back a little bit, here's the rest of the illustration that I just showed you a moment ago. And then a couple of pages back from there, another illustration where Machaut depicts himself, or has an artist depict him, as an old man, still with these same gifts of nature. And if I go back a little bit further, you can see the table of contents very neatly ordered according to the genre of the music or poetry contained in this manuscript. So it's fun. It's a picture book to leaf through. Okay, now on to Scott's presentation. By introducing us to this piece of music and where it comes from. What is this exactly?
Well, Machaut wrote music in his secular songs in three different forms: the ballade, the virelai, and the rondo. The rondo is the modern new one, and he becomes more interested in that as his life progresses, and that's sort of the legacy that he left to the 15th century, where the rondo becomes overwhelmingly the most popular form. But this piece is a ballade, which dominates his production in the earlier parts of his career. And that's normally a three stanza form. So you see here over in the leftmost column that capital B. That's the first word of the song Viaute qui toutes autres père. And then to the right of that B, in the other column, you'll see a T. That's the tenor. T for tenor, tenor or, as it says, and that is the tenor part. A two-part song. And then when you flip the page, you'll see at the top of the next column the text for the second and the third stanzas. And in a ballade, it can be of a varying number of lines. But the key thing about the ballade is that the last line of each stanza is the same. And in this case, it says Monta semis que pour amer mourrai. You've brought me to such a pass that I am going to die for love. So what we're looking at is from so-called manuscript C. Now, Machaut is really, really unusual for any composer for centuries, and certainly for even centuries after his lifetime, in that we have a number of manuscripts, not just one, but a small handful of manuscripts that are actually connected to him. He's somehow involved with their production or supervised their production, and so these are quite authoritative readings. And in fact, one of these manuscripts that was produced in Reims, which is his home toward the end of his life, right at the end of his life in the mid 1370s, it actually says at the beginning, "This is the order that G. de Machaut wished to have in his book." So it's like an imprimatur. I, Machaut, certify that this is the right order that you should encounter all my works. And a huge amount of it at the beginning is poetry. There's the Remède de Fortune, and there's a ton of other narrative poems, and then eventually he gets to a big section which contains poems which do not have any songs, and then finally at the end, then there's all the poems that do have music. And of course, most of his output is secular song. There's the one mass and about 24 motets, which are secular as well. So here we're looking at a copy of this piece, Viotti, in its earliest source, so-called manuscript C, which was prepared circa 1350, possibly begun a little bit before that and finished slightly afterwards. But this piece is found in all 5 of the complete works, manuscripts that have some connection to Machaut. 4 of those actually come from his lifetime, and then 2 from shortly thereafter. And they all have letters, and they're ABC. There's no D. There's E. F and G are 2 parts of one thing, and then there's VG, capital V, small g, which is related to the name of the 19th century owner. Unfortunately, it would be really nice if A was the first and B was the second, but no, C is the earliest, then B, then A, but actually between C and B, we have to fit in VG, and B is a copy of VG, and then A is the last one during Machaut's life, and then F, anyway, it's quite complicated and not alphabetically in order. So I have to look at a sheet of paper every time I have to think about this, otherwise I forget which is which, but C is the earliest. And maybe now we could look at the copy of this song from manuscript A. This is the one that was prepared late in Machaut's life, where he says, "This is the order I want to have in my song." And you can see here, first of all, the layout's changed. There's no longer this 2-column layout, which is really a 13th century layout. It's changed to the more modern layout, just 1 column with the discantus part on top, and then the tenor part underneath that, and then there are the 2 stanzas of text at the bottom. So here it all fits onto 1 page. And then we could look at manuscript E. Now, this was actually prepared after Machaut's lifetime, as far as we know, and probably not long afterwards. And here, it's on the leftmost page, the second decorated initial there. That's where the song belongs here. That's right, Viotti there, and the discantus parts runs 2.5 systems, and then there's another little decorated thing. That's where the tenor part starts, and then the middle of the next and last system, now we have something we haven't seen before, contratenor. This is a 3rd part for the song. It starts there and it goes on to the top of the next page, and then we have in a big paragraph the rest of the text underneath it. So here we have a 3rd part for this 2-voice song. And this is the way that the song has mostly been presented in the complete works editions. and recorded also. I think partly because it's three voices, it's a three-voice song. That sort of became the standard in the 15th century. But for Machaut, actually, it's not at all. He wrote a lot of two-voice music, and in fact, a lot of monophonic music as well. And this contratenor is quite possibly not by him. So when we first, Blue Heron, when we first encountered this song, our mandate was to record this version of it. It was an anthology, a recorded anthology accompanying Tom Kelly's book, Capturing Music, which I recommend to everybody in the class who is interested in medieval notation. It's a fantastic book, very accessible, packed with information. It has a lot of great pictures, and there's a CD as well. And so Tom asked us to record this version of it, which we did in three voices, in three parts. And then it was only later on when we were doing it for another purpose. It's part of our production of the Remède de Fortune, of the added music that we added to that show. I began to look into the situation more deeply, and that was when I learned, oh, well, it's a two-voice song, and this contra is probably not by Machaut. And in fact, although it's really, really beautiful in three parts, it's even better in two. It's really perfect in two parts. And the contra adds, but it also kind of muddies the water a little bit. But there are so many questions raised here. Maybe we could go back to manuscript C, that very first one, which is perhaps the easiest to look at. So here we have, again, the discantus beginning on the left there with the blue B and the tenor to its right. So the obvious fact here is the top part has all the words and the tenor doesn't have anything. Now, in the olden days, i.e. when people first started singing Machaut again, 60s, 70s, we all assumed, well, I have to say, not I was alive in the 70s, but not of an age to be performing Machaut. It was assumed that these untexted parts must be for instruments. Obviously, there's no words, it's an instrumental part, and so they were played on any number of things. And for Machaut, you know, there are pictures from this era of ensembles with singers and instruments, and there are some accounts that suggest that singers and instruments did perform songs together. I know of more from the 15th century, but it's clearly a tradition that was there. So I think that is a very, very good option. That, of course, doesn't tell you what instrument to use. We can be pretty sure that it would be a family from the soft family. I know that you were talking about louds and softs and how medieval musicians thought about instruments. So the soft instruments are the appropriate ones here for use with a singer for doing secular music. That could be an organetto, a little pump organ that you might hold in your lap, or it could be a lute, or it could be a harp, or it could be a fiddle. It could possibly be a doucenne. This is a double reed instrument which is mentioned in Machaut and thought of very highly. He actually says that when he talks about Hope, the allegorical character in the Remède de Fortune, her voice is as sweet as a doucenne. And of course, a doucenne, it's called a doucenne because it's very, very sweet. And if you ever hear Deborah Nagy play one of these things, you will understand why. In fact, it's a fantastic instrument. Very limited range, quite limited chromatically, but fits pretty much every tenor, makes a great tenor instrument. Now, okay, so that's the instrumental solution. But along in sort of 70s, 80s, there emerged in England, mostly driven by Christopher Page and his group, Gothic Voices, and then sort of seconded by David Fallows, and a number of people also contributed to this idea that, well, no, 14th century song seems, they thought, was for voices only, and that these untexted parts, you would apply text to them, or you could apply text to them. Could be all the text, you might break up longer notes into small ones, and there is certainly evidence of that being done. I know that mostly from the earlier 15th century, but there's clear evidence that that happened. You take a tenor part, you need to say 3 syllables, you have 1 note, you just repeat. Um, so, or you could do partial texting, not change the rhythmic character of the piece, but just fit in as much of the text as you could. Or this idea was suggested that you might just vocalize on some vowel. Now, that is a really attractive solution, actually. We've done a lot of it. You pick a vowel, a French vowel. You don't want to pick an English vowel for this, but something that would be good in French, something that doesn't interfere with the main line. It allows you to have all the sort of beauty and balance and flexibility of an all vocal ensemble without the tenor part messing up the intelligibility of the upper line, which will be the only one singing text. And that would also be true, for example, in say, if you imagine a 4-part Machaut piece, where it's usually the second part from the top that will have the text. And then the triplum above it is untexted, and then the tenor and a contratenor below will also be untexted. And if all of those parts are vocalized, and just the second part, the one with text, actually sings text, you can hear the text all the way through, and it becomes a song with a sort of vocal accompaniment. Works beautifully, I have to say, really, really beautifully. It's quite taxing for the vocalizers, because to maintain one vowel for the up to 9, 10, 11, 12 minutes of a ballade, that's quite a challenge. It really tires you out. I will say, however, that there is no specific evidence whatsoever for that practice from the 14th century. So it's a 20th century invention, which may correspond to something that may have happened in the 14th century, but we can't really say more than that, which is true about so many of our solutions to medieval performance. There just isn't that much that we know. Machaut helps us with certain details. If he's actually really good at the underlay in these manuscripts. The notes tend to fall in clusters. And if is there a way to sort of blow that up a little bit so we could look a little more closely at the beginning of the vocal part? So if we look now closely at the beginning of the discantus part, you can see the way he's grouped the notes and left spaces between groups of notes, right? So the first syllable, biao, gets 1 note, and then te gets the next 3, and then ki gets ya-da-da-da-dum, and then there's a little break after that longer note. It's very small, and then the next note is the beginning of tu, tes. Then there's a rest, and then we get 2 syllables. Outre, père, envers, moi. So, and this is really typical of the Machaut manuscripts. They're quite helpful. This helpfulness about underlay persists into the beginning of the 15th century, and then it just completely disappears. So if you're used to working on later 15th century songs, it's a nightmare. We have no idea specifically how text was underlaid. We can draw certain inferences, but fortunately Machaut has been very, very clear about it. And it's a good thing he's clear, I have to say, if this is, assuming this is the way he wants it, because often it's not what you would do. It's not what one would necessarily naturally do. But he has a very, very specific idea about how to do it.
Okay.
All right.
Would you like to talk a little bit about the text of this song?
Sure. It's a text which features this sort of typical, it's one of these typical poetic strategies of placing things in opposition to one another. Beauty appear to all others. In other words, your beauty is better than everybody else's, but towards me, you are inconstant and distant, strange or estranged. You have an exquisite sweetness, which is at the same time bitter to me, and so forth. It goes back and forth. Basically, you have an innocent countenance with a heart of steel. You have a beautiful glance, but nevertheless kills a lover. You appear to be joyful, but your actual words are upsetting, distressing. And because of all this, when I look at you and I see something lovely, but the messages are very, very negative. Because of this, I have been brought to the pass that I will die for love. Pour amer mourrai. And so forth. It goes on for that. Always ending up with the same last line, the refrain. He goes also on in the second stanza here. He brings in a lot of these characters from the Roman de la Rose. This is the 13th century text you probably touched on, which is sort of the foundational text of courtly love in a way, where all these allegorical characters, and they crop up in songs throughout the 14th century and then into the 15th century, standing for the lover's emotional states. Basically, they're sort of psychological shorthand for the lover's state, and also for the openness or not so much openness of the beloved towards the lover's advances or desires. So on the one hand, on his side are fair welcome, bel accueil, but against him are characters like danger. Danger is, it's not really danger, it means sort of, this is the lover's, it's the lady's self-possession and ability to push away things which may compromise her honor or get her involved in situations which she doesn't want to be involved in. And danger in the Roman de la Rose itself, actually, he's an incredibly violent character. He carries a club which has got all these spikes in it, and he's really unpleasant. He shows up here as well. So we have actually recorded, Blue Heron actually has recorded now this song twice, because we recorded it first for Tom in the 3-voice version, and looking at that one, I thought, okay, we have this wonderful high tenor, Owen McIntosh. So he's the top part on all of the times that we have recorded it, and it means that we do it more or less at the written pitch. I don't know that has any meaning really in the 13th century, in the sense that one could adapt a song to any ensemble at hand and pick the pitch which suited you. What's really important is that you get the scale correct and the mode and the pattern of steps. But we've done it. It happens to fit Owen's range very beautifully at circa 440, and we don't know it. We really know very, very little about pitch in the 14th century. If you take a really big picture and extrapolate back from when we do know something about pitch, which is really like after 1600, we can see that actually a pitch around 440 is probably about right as a sort of general standard for all sorts of reasons, but probably not 440 itself, which is really only a majority pitch in the 20th century. The more normal pitches in the early 17th century, and for a long time after that, are either a semitone lower than that, which is 415, the famous 415 of the sort of Baroque standard pitch, and then a whole tone above that, around 465 or 466. These are hertz, right? Our A440 is 440 hertz. And so actually, I think when we recorded this the first time, we might have still been actually at 440. And the second time, when then we've come back to it and recorded it at 465. But it's, that's a pretty fine distinction. But when we did it the first time, we did it actually with two fiddles on the bottom parts, and then the second time using this vocalizing um, option.
So which one should we hear first?
Well, I think it's best to hear the two voice version first, which is clearly that's my show. And then you might want to hear the three-part one with the added contra, and then maybe listen again to a little bit of the two-part one and see that, it's so interesting that adding a part doesn't always add value overall. So this is Owen McIntosh and then Jason McStutes singing tenor. Yeah, and you can hear how Marceau's incredible control of the like where he's using dissonance. It's really clear in a two-part piece where he's dissonant and where he's consonant, and the expression that is gotten out of these dissonances. Some of which are very, I mean, they're all sort of correct eventually, but they're stretching the system.
Absolutely, yeah. It's really beautiful. Okay, shall we listen to a little bit of the three voice version?
Sure.
The score for that two voice version. Here's the three voice version.
It's really, really, really beautiful. But in fact, adding a third point part sort of takes away some of the pungency of the dissonances, interestingly enough.
But first, I thought I'd share with you a little tiny excerpt of poetry that gives you a sense of how he wrote himself into his poems. So this is from another one of these big, long narrative poems. And in this case, he sort of takes the character of the narrator, so you can see him here, and he is discussing the love woes of this duke, who's actually also a real person. He's the son of Bonne of Luxembourg. And Machaut is talking to him about Machaut's own social status, his role as a as an advisor, and the ways in which he's sort of constrained by social structures. So he says, and though I might be a clerk who is ignorant, incapable, and inept, yet I have been, by my two faiths, in such a place several times with the good king of Bohemia, and may God keep his soul among his company. And despite myself, I was brave, because there was no place, no path, no byway where I knew to flee, and thus I had to be courageous. So he's this character who's actually risen up from the lower classes to be in this advisory position that's actually sort of above his, above the social status that he was born into. So here is another one of these long poems. It's called The Remedy for Fortune. And this is a fascinating poem as well, for all sorts of reasons. This is the poem that I mentioned that he wrote to commemorate Bon of Luxembourg, his beloved patron. And this whole poem is actually about the cultivation of memory. So most obviously in the fact that it is a commemoration of Bon of Luxembourg, but also in all kinds of ways that he tells the story and incorporates music into it. So this poem is a bit unusual because it has interpolations of music in this poem. So it's a combination of narrative and lyric poetry. And it tells the story of this lover who is kind of tortured. He doesn't know if his beloved loves him, and it's so difficult, and he feels basically tossed by the whims of fortune, who doesn't care at all about human emotion. You can see her here, blindfolded, turning her wheel. And the allegorical character who comes to console him is Lady Hope. So this is very much a riff on this ancient text of Boethius that we looked at quite a while ago, the Consolation of Philosophy, in which Lady Philosophy comes to console Boethius about, fortune's whims. But in this case, it's Lady Hope who comes to talk to this sad lover. And over the course of this poem, Machaut actually works his way through every genre of music that had been handed down to him, beginning at the beginning with the oldest kinds of music, when the lover is really sort of down on his luck. And as the lover kind of works through his situation and grows in wisdom, Machaut works through newer and newer genres of music as this poem goes on. So this poem is actually what the Blue Heron concert that was most recently in Vancouver was sort of wrapped around. So I asked Scott to describe this poem a little bit for you. So I'll share that with you now.
The Remedy for Fortune, it's a long 4,000 line or so narrative poem, and a didactic one, teaching about how you can survive in a world which is not designed for your happiness. It's spoken in the voice of a young and inexperienced lover, although he's looking back from a few years later on the events that he narrates here. He falls desperately in love, and it, for one reason or another, it's fraught and frustrated, and he suffers greatly. And he is assisted by Hope, who is descends and comes to him, and where he's lamenting at great length in a garden, and she says, "Why do you trouble yourself so? You have a lovely lady to love, and she may not love you, or she may, and things may or may not work out, but you need to not basically don't attach to the outcome. Enjoy what you have." don't expect fortune to bring you good things. And if she does bring you good things, don't expect them to last, because they won't. Fortune doesn't care about you or anybody else in the world. And if she behaved otherwise, she wouldn't be fortune. This is just her nature. It's a sort of Zen lesson, I always think, you know. But this is this teaching, this sort of ethical teaching about how to behave ethically and how to lead a happy life when things are not going well. That's a really core teaching of Machaut's through all his narrative and lyric poetry. And you know, this is a man they knew from disaster in this century. You know, the Remède is dedicated to, or was intended for, in a way, his favorite patron, Bonne of Luxembourg, who was a Bohemian princess from the daughter of the King of Bohemia and married to the Duke of Normandy. And she died at the age of 34 in 1349 from the plague, probably. You know, the Black Death comes down here in 48, I think, 49, and half the population of France died within 2 or 3 years. Machaut lived through this. And it's not the only thing, you know. Bonne, she died at 34. She had 10 children. Yeah, 3 of whom didn't survive infancy. So, you know, the suffering of just a sort of normal life in that age was enormous. And yet, you know, Machaut's music and his poetry and his whole outlook is incredibly positive. And it's not a kind of, it's not, what's very interesting about it, you know, we think of the Middle Ages as being in Europe as the era of Christendom, and that Christianity saturated everything, which is of course true, but this aspect of Machaut's philosophy and art has really nothing to do with that. It's a really independent or parallel way of thinking. And you know, he was a priest. He was ordained, but his life, his art is almost entirely secular. Actually, there's the mass, but other than that, many songs in French.
So I will share some of that mass with you now, because I actually think that Machaut's motets and his mass help to understand who he was as a person, and help to kind of bring together what seemed to be kind of 2 separate identities almost, this like very worldly, world-wise courtier and this clergyman. And Machaut's motets, although they have largely secular texts, these are those pieces that, for one thing, have a chant in the tenor voice, but also often Machaut mixes in with the other texts in the motet religious references. And what we see happening is that Machaut actually parallels the quest of the courtly lover with the quest of the believer for wisdom or for union with Christ. So he notes that both have hearts inflamed by love, both are willing to suffer for love, both are hopeful of joyful union or reunion at some point. And this is actually, I think, a way that you can understand Machaut's mass as well. So Machaut is the first composer to conceive the idea that you might set music for the mass as a unity. So keep in mind that the chant that happens in the mass is separated over the course of basically a 3-hour service in many cases, right? This is a huge thing. And the idea that you might actually link pieces of chant over the course of that long time probably just didn't really seem necessary or feasible. Mostly composers would set just individual chants for particularly special occasions, and typically they would choose to set the chants that were special for the feast day. So they would set a chant that was expressly about Christmas for Christmas Mass. But Machaut sets the texts of the Mass that are said every day. So he sets the most commonly used chants, which is smart actually, because it means that you get more playtime for your composition. Basically, you put all the effort in, but then that composition can be performed on any special event because it uses the most common texts. So he makes this thing with the Kyrie and the Gloria and the Credo and the Sanctus and the Agnus Dei, all set with matching music. Sometimes the music refers back to previous movements of the Mass and so on. And it's a kind of musical monument that he makes. First of all, to the Virgin Mary, who kind of emerges in this as the object of Machaut's courtly love. She is his patroness because she's the patroness of the cathedral in Reims, which is the Cathedral Notre Dame. She is the woman that he worships. And so we have this musical tribute to the Virgin Mary that's kind of a parallel to that poetic tribute that he makes to Bonne of Luxembourg. But this is also a musical tribute, musical monument to himself, because Machaut actually endowed the continuing performance of this Mass after his death. And we think that it may have been performed in the cathedral in Reims up to 100 years after he died. So this Mass is all about remembrance. The same theme that comes up so often in his secular music and poetry. So here is a performance of the Gloria from this Mass.